introduce everybody, but Layla's going to introduce herself and speak for a few minutes. But I will say hello to Diane Regisford, who's standing as a candidate for University Parks, and Ian Middleton, who's standing for Kidlington South in the coming elections. So hello, both of you. And then if you'll introduce yourselves when you first speak, perhaps if you want to say a little bit more.
Could I ask that people mute themselves when they're not talking, please?
Yeah, that's a great idea, because it echoes on different people's machines. I'm not going to mute myself or it'll be embarrassing when I forget. Okay, so
know in advance that it'll happen to someone. So
it will, yes. Okay, all right. Well, with that, unless somebody reminds me of something else I've forgotten, I'm going to hand over to you, Layla.
Great.
Okay.
Well, it's lovely to see you all, and I'm so sorry as ever that it's not in a, you know, church hall somewhere where we're more likely to have done this in normal times. And I hope you're all okay. And it's been quite the year. And so I thought what I might do is sort of center my remarks on what I've been doing most recently, with a sort of an eye looking forward, obviously, to very important local elections that are happening in May. And I'm delighted as ever that our parties have led from the front in terms of seeing logical sense for how to play the first past the post system and just get really good people elected to council. So that's been really, really positive, I think. And I'm delighted that we've managed to continue to foster such respect and trust between the two groups. And actually, I mean, I know from my colleagues who are on South Oxfordshire that if you put all of that cabinet in a room and didn't tell people who was which party, you'd be hard pressed to tell sometimes. And I think that's how it should work, and yet also maintain our distinct identities. It's really is everything I'd hoped for and more. So it's great to be with you. So it's actually been a really good week, because I'll start with what I hope is actually fantastic news. Many of you will remember, and I'm sure I've reported back to you in the past, how I ran and have been running for a few years now a campaign to scrap the Vagrancy Act, which is an act that basically makes sleeping rough illegal in this country. It's outdated, Dickensian, horrifically punitive legislation. And Robert Gendrick let slip on the floor of the House today that he also thinks that it should be repealed and consigned to history, which is our closest sign yet that when the review comes back, which we're expecting it will in the next few weeks, that the recommendation will be a full repeal of the Act, and then some updating of a few bits of more modern legislation for a few, you know, and there are some parts of it that I think we accept now wouldn't have completely gone. But actually that they will be covered under new legislation rather than as part of the old legislation. And so that's a win, everybody. So I'm really delighted to be able to report that, because it goes to show, and it was very much a campaign based in our community, actually started by young people in Oxford. And I always give them full credit for that. So we've done something great together, and I know many of you will have been involved in various ways over the years. So we haven't quite got there yet. I'm waiting for the official announcement, but it just goes to show that just because it hasn't done before doesn't mean it can't be done, which is basically my motto these days. What's taking up a lot of my time, and I'll come to sort of the more local stuff in a moment, and actually there is a huge amount of local stuff that's going on, and not just to do with incompetence at the county council, which no doubt we'll touch on, but also obviously coronavirus. Our casework has doubled. We counted up the number of cases that we'd answered in the last 12 months, and it was equal to the number of cases that we had answered in the 2.5 years previous, which I think pretty much underlines just how much strife there is out there right now. Underlined in things like the job claimant percentages for Oxfordshire have shot up tenfold. I think it's 11-fold last I looked. Still relatively low at just over 3%, but actually given that we started at something like 0.3, 0.4%, that will be being replicated across the country. And I'm increasingly worried, and I always was, but I'm increasingly worried about the impact that coronavirus is going to have on wider inequality in society. And we're already seeing some of that play out in the uptake of the vaccine, but also in the number of cases per 100,000 that we're seeing in more deprived areas of all parts of the country. I mean, there was a comment made a few months ago by Whitty that in some deprived communities, coronavirus had become endemic. And the reason for that was because of poor state of housing, huge numbers of people living under the same roof. When people are being asked to isolate, they can't do so effectively because they just literally don't have the room, or they don't have the money to be able to support themselves. They've got insecure work. And so this is the human lives cost, very barefaced, of a lot of the inequalities that I know we all share, that we want to stamp out from society more generally. And therein lies, I hope, a bit of a realization by people that actually that inequality is something we need to sort out. We need to help, because no one is safe unless everyone is safe. This applies both internationally, and I'll come on to that in a moment, but also when it comes to the national. Boris Johnson is talking about, vaccinating everybody and hoping that we will come back to some sort of sense of normality. I personally think that step 4 of his plan is a pipe dream. I honestly don't think we're ever going to get there. But nevertheless, if we are going to ever get to a point of quote unquote normality, then you can only do that if you tackle head on the fact that for some communities, they have struggled with this much more than others. So the other thing that's been really very fun to work on, and I mean that in a sort of politician sense, whereby you feel you're doing a lot of good, which I still maintain is the best reason to be a politician. Everything else should fall by the wayside from that very basic principle, and it's still very much my driving force. But it's chairing the all-party group on coronavirus. And that has been enormously influential. In fact, the Today programme just last week said that we were an influential group of MPs. So I think that's endorsement enough. And we've been running an inquiry since last summer into coronavirus. And most recently, it's kind of zeroed in on the issue of long COVID. So for those who are less familiar with it, it's not simply, as you might do after a virus or something, feel a grotty for a few weeks afterwards, and then it kind of ebbs and goes away. Long COVID is different. We now know that we didn't at the beginning, that coronavirus itself is not a respiratory disease. It's more of a neurological disease that will affect many different organ systems. And in some people, particularly those who have mild or moderate symptoms, it then goes on to manifest new symptoms that weren't present before that person had coronavirus, 12 weeks or more after the initial bout of coronavirus. And what's really, truly scary about it is that it can happen even if you get it asymptomatically at first. The ONS study that's been done on this suggests, and it was a small sample, but suggests it can be 1 in 10 people will get this, so have symptoms more than 12 weeks later. The WHO literally in the last 2 hours has just released its paper on long COVID, and have echoed more or less what we've been saying here. And the implications for wider society on ignoring long COVID, particularly in the government's plan with the opening up and everything else, is really, really important. My belief is that the government went wrong right at the very beginning. There were 2 paths that they could have followed. One was the Southeast Asian China model, modeling the pandemic response not on flu, which is what we did, but actually on SARS and MERS. And when you focus in on that strategy, there is only one way to tackle this, and that is elimination. And that means getting cases incredibly low, having a test, trace, isolate system that works, that is locally led. And I know there's lots of people on here who have been involved in that campaign. Tina, indeed. And the reason why that's so important is because unless you get people to isolate, then you can't cut the chains of transmission, and you will always have cases that are circulating in the wider community, which then lead to more cases. And we know what exponential growth looks like now. So there was only one strategy that was going to work, and the government didn't follow it. It followed some other strategy based on avian flu, which they had modeled on, and that was what Cygnus was all about. And unfortunately, they got it wrong right at the beginning. And there was a choice at that point, and there were people who were pushing for it. And what I find increasingly frustrating, after 122,000 people or so have now died from this, an economy that's hurt certainly the worst of the G7 and one of the worst in the world, is that it could have been different. And so we're really pushing for that public inquiry, but all the while, and I didn't want to wait, and this is why we set up the all-party group, is we're trying to make that case. So our strategy, which follows very closely, we're not calling it zero COVID. And the reason why is because I think that the word zero COVID is itself slightly misleading, because it's not zero COVID everywhere, because actually in the middle of a pandemic, that's not going to be possible. And you'll have noticed Boris Johnson was attacking zero COVID and then willfully misinterpreting what it meant. Zero COVID always meant zero unmanaged cases in the community. And so you will expect that there will be flare-ups. You will expect that someone will bring it in on a plane, or someone will get it from somewhere. But the point is, do you have a test, trace, isolate system that can catch it, manage it, and then stop it? And that is what Australia has done. That is what New Zealand has done. China has done it. Taiwan has done it. Vietnam has done it. So it's not just landlocked countries that have done it. And it was possible for us to do it. The moment would have been last summer. And it's still possible for us to do it, and we continue to push on this. So that's really been taking up huge amounts of my time, in amongst the work I'm doing on fighting the cut to 0.7% in my role of foreign affairs spokesperson, and everything else to do with the constituency. And I did a debate on flooding yesterday. So it's been very, very busy. But I thought I'd sort of stop there. And I know we're going to cover a lot of different things in the questions, and I wanted to give as much time for that as possible. So back to you, Sarah.
Great. Thanks very much, Layla. That's great. That was a real rapid tour there. Okay, so first question. Now I know, Caroline, you're here. Caroline Roth, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Right.
And thank you, Layla, for what you've told us. Really exciting stuff there. And also this question is about judicial review. And I know that I've thanked you recently on that account, actually, for your support of judicial review in general. Anyway, the question is, what is the panel's view on the government spending vast sums of money defending itself in judicial review cases, subverting the legal process and making sure it can't be called to account? How can this be challenged?
Well,
okay, I'll hand you to Layla. I'll give you the first go at each one.
Well, just a couple of things. I mean, first of all, you will have seen that me, Caroline, and Debbie Abrams took Matt Hancock to court and won, and I won a T-shirt that says as much. And I mean, what we won on was actually a point of transparency, and the point that I made in my remarks to him was actually transparency and trust right now are just as important as PPE in saving lives. And that's the problem with what they've done, is that by the chumocracy that we've seen in government, it just looks bad, and they will defend themselves and defend themselves and defend themselves. But when it happens over and over and over again, and I've got small businesses in Oxfordshire who have come to me and said, why is it that, this chap who's never manufactured a piece of PPE in his life gets a £30 million contract, and meanwhile here I am having done it for 20 years and I don't get a look in? How is that fair? And so that whole narrative just undermines trust in government. And unusually for me, and I'm sure you all feel the same, actually this last year has been a time where I desperately wanted government to do well for all of our sakes, because that was how you were going to save lives. And then we found out that the government had earmarked £1 million to defend the case that we'd brought, and were trying to basically scare us off by making us liable for literally millions of pounds worth of litigation costs. Well, actually, as it happens, we won, so they had to pay. And second of all, actually the judge capped it. But the practice of earmarking all this money to try and stop them from being held to account, I'm glad that the courts are able to cap it and are able to see through it. The practice itself is, I think, very reflective of the way that the government works, which is that it's a government that wants to act with impunity, and then when it gets caught out, doesn't even apologize, says it would do it again. And I just have absolutely no faith in them, and the way that they've handled themselves over this case is, you know, if we ever wanted more motivation, I think there was 121,000 reasons to get rid of the Tories at the moment, and that's growing. But if you wanted more, then that would be it.
Right, thank you. Ian, I think you wanted to have a word on this one.
Well, yeah, it was also to bring it back more to a sort of local level as well. I know Layla's going to be aware that there are judicial reviews now pending. There's one pending in Charwell in my district against the partial review that was brought by the Tory-controlled local council, which is going to devastate Greenbelt in this area. And the same thing is happening in South Oxfordshire. And in South Oxfordshire's case, it's actually even to some extent worse, because they were directed and they were basically leaned on and bullied by Robert Jenrick, so by central government, to do things that, you know, they didn't really want to do as elected councillors and in representing the people that elected them. And it's just an indication of the way that this government operates at all levels, really. Certainly in Charwell, there were 1,500 objections to the local plan review. There were numerous representations over several years, campaigns, and none of it made one iota of difference to the council. And their view was, well, and in fact, the leader of the council came to a meeting early on in the process, and I'm not sure, I think you were there, Layla, and basically said, if you want to get anywhere with this, you need to lawyer up. And for a local council leader to say that to the people that he's representing, why should we need to lawyer up? We voted in a council on a democratic basis to support and look after our interests. And they are taking the view that, no, we don't look after your interests, we look after the interests, in this case, of property owners, landowners, developers, the people that are going to make huge amounts of money out of this, not least the university. And I think we're just seeing that across the board. This seems to be the MO of this government, that we will just take a position where, and particularly in the case that the Good Law case that's going ahead, I wasn't sure if that was the one you were referring to, Layla, because the article I've read here was from...
There's several ongoing. So the one that I was involved in was specifically over transparency and timings in the publishing of contracts. And then there's a few other cases about specific contracts that are in the works as well, but we're not directly involved in.
Because I understand the other thing they're doing on that particular case is they're doing this huge disclosure thing, which basically buries you in paperwork, so you can't get through it. I mean, and that is another kind of example of the way that I've discovered, even at local council level, it works. Particularly, we've just come out of our budget, and to find the little bits of information that they don't want you to find that are buried in the middle of these documents. It is very much like, you know, for those of us that will remember the Yes Prime Minister series, you know, if you want to bury something, you produce a report that big, and it's just a totally untransparent way to operate government, and we do need to stop it.
Thank you. I'll go straight on to the next one, and that is Michelle. Are you wanting to ask it?
Yes, why not? Yes, in a post-truth world, democracy cannot survive. So what can we do to transform this and come back to more sanity? So does the panel agree that the parties in opposition should do more to expose the lies from the Prime Minister and cabinet members every time they break the laws or fail to deliver, and every time they impinge on democratic processes? What plan do you have to bring the exposure at the required level to trigger a change? Yes, ma'am, that is it. Thank you.
Okay, Layla.
Thanks, Michelle, for your question. I think, bluntly, the problem we have is that they lie all the time. And it's almost nothing comes out of them where there isn't something. And sometimes I wonder, is it just that they're not very clever, and they just keep getting things wrong? And then I say to myself, well, no, because they've got the entire armory of government behind them, and there must be must be just the new modus operandi. And actually, I used to believe, and I think there is an element within the Conservative Party, and this is a little controversial in some circles, but I don't think that all Tories are evil. I think there are some who very legitimately, have a different view of the world, have every right to express it, but actually are doing their best for their communities. And I think we can agree that there are certainly some councillors locally who we would put in that box. But there are also others. And I think the way the whole party operates and the way that they see the democratic system more generally is that the democratic system is a means to an end to give the Tories power, rather than power being a function of the democratic system itself. And I think there is genuinely a difference of opinion as to how that works. And I think, one of the ways that we've seen that is the interference that they've done with the elections. Were they going to go ahead? Were they not? They keep changing the rules, so it's advantageous for them and not for others. I don't think there's any sort of sense of fairness. The parliamentary boundary review is happening, and we have every reason to suspect that they're going to try to gerrymander it their way. We're looking at this already very carefully now. I'm sure you've got your best number crunchers on it as well, because it really does matter. And in terms of the specifics of what they say and how we hold them to account, yes, I mean, we do. I've got an easier job in the foreign affairs brief because actually that tends to be just a bit more factual. And it's one of the areas where, given that, yes, this country's bad, but other countries are worse, we tend to be more on the same side of human rights, at least. And so I found myself being a slightly uncomfortable legislative bedfellow with people like Ian Duncan Smith when it comes to the Uyghurs and genocide. And actually, we are absolutely on the same side of that. And I will tell you, it was been a surprise, but a pleasant one, because actually what you end up doing is running the government very close. And there's a genocide amendment that we've been very involved in, that some of you might have seen, that is actually making its way back to the Commons now, having been defeated again. The government was defeated again in the Lords. It's the third time we're going to see it. And there is a chance that we'll get somewhere. So I think it's about picking your moment. And it's about making sure that wherever you can, you point it out. But bluntly, Michelle, if we're going to solve this, I think it's going to need a change of government. And I will plug for the local elections, because actually this matters as much locally as it does nationally. Some people will have seen today the county council has admitted that it got a tendering process wrong and has had to pay out £1.6 million in damages to a firm. Well, actually, it was £1 million, and it spent something like £600,000 on legal advice for one case, which just strikes me as bizarre. For context, that is the adult and children's social care budgets combined, I believe. I've got that number wrong, but it's huge. It's huge amounts of money. And we certainly could have put much better use of taxpayers' money than that. Now, we still don't know what happened. And it all comes back to a culture of transparency and a culture of truth. And by changing the county council, actually, we could introduce that to that level of government, certainly in May. And then hopefully one day we can do it with Boris Johnson and his lot in the Westminster government as well.
Thank you. And this is another one for Ian, I think. Am I right, Ian?
Yeah, I think I'm only doing this one, and then I think Diane's doing the next one, so it's not me hogging all the limelight. Yes. Yeah, I mean, I sort of, the thing that this sort of inspired in me was a kind of re-reference. I'm sure we all know the Joseph Goebbels quote about, if you tell a lie long enough and keep repeating it, eventually people come to believe it. And he also said it actually becomes vitally important for the state to use all of its powers to repress dissent, which I think takes us back to the previous question. So we can see a kind of theme emerging here. Not that I want to invoke Godwin's law and start bringing the Nazis into it, but it's a right right-wing kind of trope, isn't it? That they know what's right, and they need to suppress everything else. How we deal with it, I think we need to continually hold them to account, and that's very difficult sometimes as minority parties. And I find it very difficult as a councillor on a party on a council where I'm the only Green. We've got 2 Lib Dems and 2 Independents that sit with me, and we work together quite closely. But we are swamped, pretty much outnumbered 2 to 1 with 32 Tories, who aren't very keen on us holding them to account. So I tend to try and put more stuff in the media, and certainly with things like citizen journalism. And I know there's a question later about the power of the media, and I think citizen journalism and that kind of stuff is quite important now. Hence the reason I think my government a few years ago tried to bring in powers to try and sort of reduce that element of the media. But I think the other thing we have to be careful of is that we don't push this idea of we don't have any way of stopping this, because it does then reduce people's engagement with politics and belief that their vote makes a difference. And really, in the system we've got at the moment, voting is the only way we can change things. We've seen all the campaigns during the referendum and the XR campaigns and things like that. So public pressure does have an impact, but that has to be backed up with votes. And we really just need to sort of push this through the sort of political dimension. I think as the right has gained more power, a grip on politics, the sort of mistruth has increased. So we really have to beat that back, and we have to win back the initiative through the ballot box, I think.
Great, thanks very much. I realise I'm rushing on here, and you'll have to shout very loudly if there's a desperate thing to stop, but we've got so much to get through. So I'm going on to the next question, which I'm going to read out because Bob Whedon is not here, and it was his question. It's the last one about what's it, Tories? I'm not allowed to swear on Zoom. Okay, how do we stop Boris Johnson taking credit for the success of the vaccine rollout, which is something the NHS was allowed to get on with rather than it being outsourced? Layla.
Yeah, no, you're so right. And it is deeply frustrating. Because actually, if we were and I was talking to some of my colleagues about this today, because if we were going to credit anyone with the vaccine rollout success, as you rightly point out, it was partly the NHS who have just gotten on with it, and actually our local councils as well. So actually, just a plug for how well Oxfordshire as a system has been working. And what's been happening is that behind the scenes, and every week or so, I meet with chief execs of councils, representatives from the CCGs, the LEPs, the university trusts, and we meet in one meeting. So actually the way we do it is Annalise and I meet together with them just to save them some time, and then the Tories don't like to be with us, so they meet on their own. No, I don't know why that is, but it's probably better that way. They can ask their questions, which are different. So we get sort of briefings and we talk through how the system is working. And actually, we have had a particularly successful and efficient, not just test, trace and isolate system. We were one of the leading counties on that when we finally introduced it and had the money to introduce it, but on vaccine rollout as well. And it was all about integrated working through the NHS, but with local councils who very often then through their councillors and community links have their way in, particularly to the more deprived parts of the community, and political swords were just put down. And by and large, the system will work together. What I found myself doing at points was defending the system against the Tories, because we found ourselves, and actually all the council leaders, including people like Barry and others, were on one side of the argument, trying to, for example, keep Oxfordshire as a whole county when we were going up and down the tiers. And it was the Tory MPs who were trying to stop that from happening, quite against what the public health director was saying that they should do. It all got into a horrible mess. But the real credit needs to actually go to academics in Oxford, who the day after the WHO announced that it had found this new strain, had an ad hoc conference that lasted a day, and Sarah Gilbert was there, but also a lot of others, who are expert in this space. And they came up with what they felt was going to be the plan for not just what types of vaccines would be most likely to work, but also how do they ramp up the supply chain so that it could actually get manufactured, and then to start thinking very early about rollout. And that is why we are doing so well. Let's face it, it had absolutely nothing to do with Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock. And I can say that with absolute fact, because just 2 or 3 weeks, I think, after that, I was on Question Time with Matt Hancock, and he waltzed in and kissed everyone there on the cheek, making a point of it. And having done Question Time last week, we were reminiscing about, my goodness me, do you remember when he did that? And so we know that government, Westminster government, was not taking this seriously. And the people who were taking it seriously and already starting to plan was our homegrown experts, because they're back in fashion, from Oxford. And I would love to see a statue, not of Sarah Gilbert herself, because also she's a very humble person, and I'm sure she'd say no, but of a female scientist who maybe would have a passing resemblance to Sarah Gilbert, just to recognize the role of scientists in this pandemic and what they've done. So I don't know, if you think it's a good idea, maybe we should float it. I don't know what you think.
Interesting. Can I hand over to you, Diane?
Yes, thank you. Good evening. Thank you, Layla, and everyone gathered here. Absolutely. Layla, I'm inspired to hear what you're saying about this integrated approach, because I feel one of the things that we need to look at with this question of the vaccine rollout is the huge amount of mistrust that's really prevalent on the ground. So with the communities that I am focused on, the communities that are less heard, less seen, further away from the center of even integrated approaches, which happen through counselors, so this idea of, how do we engage those voices? How do we increase opportunities for participation and really look through a community network at addressing the issues of trust? So we've spoken, an emerging theme that's coming through this evening already is transparency and trust. And I really love the way you spoke about this idea, not only the idea, but I think the absolute necessity to cultivate a culture of trust and truth, I think you said, which is really important, because what we're finding on the ground is a couple of things. One, community workers, community leaders, whether they are in officially registered community groups or not, are absolutely exhausted and traumatized as a result of this pandemic, So I think we need to focus as the Greens on what we do well, which is our grassroots mobilization, our grassroots engagement, really thinking about how we can bring communities together to ensure, yes, the voices are heard, but that we are all part of exploring and inquiring how we can rebuild trust, how we can connect communities. I think that's really important. Those for me are the really salient points, and the really crushing realities that are on the ground. People are absolutely exhausted, and the trauma, funeral after funeral. What's happening? The impact of children seeing their parents, children from, let's say, disadvantaged families whose parents are on the front line. We understand the inequities that this pandemic has unveiled. And there are so many levels of mistrust that we need to engage. And so as a result, you may well be aware, lots of people in the Black, Asian, ethnic minority communities do not want to hear anything about a vaccine. There's so many meetings, community meetings with doctors, with community leaders. Why should we vaccinate? The pros and cons of vaccination. The bottom line is that there is huge mistrust. This, the lies that we're speaking about here, absolutely. But the problem is, it's not, I don't hear people taking time to distinguish between whether it's the Tories, the Greens, or the Lib Dems. It's government, full stop. And that is a really critical thing. If we really want to mobilize voters to ensure deeper engagement in participatory democracy, then we need to be able to rebuild trust from a community level.
Can Can I ask a question of you, Diane? So in your opinion, where, and I have my opinion, but I want to know yours, of where does this mistrust come from on the ground? And as you say, a lot of these communities, they don't know who their local councillor is. They haven't got a clue. Right. Because it just doesn't affect their lives in that day-to-day way. So what has happened, and it could be this year or it could be over 10 years, or is it what has led to this? Because if I don't think we can solve that part, but it gives us a clue as perhaps to what we need to now look to solve over the next 5-10 years. What happened?
What has led to the mistrust? Is that the crux of your question? Well, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer. We need to look back at last year, the first lockdown, March last year, the global uprisings to act, for social justice, racial justice in particular. And so the historic impact of the legacy of colonialism, it has been internalized as trauma. Yes. So when we look at, I'm just giving my perspective, when we look at government, those in authority, we have an idea that these people are not for us. They don't care about us. Our lives are not their priority. It's a really complex web of issues, and the talk around and all the flurry around diversity and inclusion, we have to really move that from what is perceived as talk, cheap talk, something that's not substantiated, to really integrating, re-looking our policies, looking within our own parties and seeing, holding up the mirror to ourselves and saying, actually, what does this mean for us? Because as you said earlier, Layla, the fact that it hasn't been done before does not mean that we can't change it. And there's some very key things that we have to change to be able to begin to rebuild that trust. So one, I think, would be creating spaces, which are equitable, where we can come together and inquire. This is definitely the approach I'm taking with my campaign. We're creating inquiry spaces because, you see, there's a lot of talk around lived experience, less talk around experiential knowledge. There's knowledge, there's intel on the ground. And I asked the question, how often is that accessed? And even if the bridges were to be built for it to be accessed, the lack of trust would mean that that knowledge, which could help inform policy, would not be communicated because we don't trust them. This is what drives me to stand, because, I know for a fact that when I see somebody that looks like me, I'm more inclined to be able to be inspired, to be a bit more open and say, okay, let me come to a conversation. I may not immediately trust you, but at least there's somebody who knows what I've been through. And that is really important. So really, this diversity and inclusion conversation has to unfold in so many different ways. It's a complex situation.
Thank you. I really appreciate your perspective. Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I'm seeing thumbs up. Yes. Okay, I'm going to go on to the next question, and that's from Tina and Caroline. Tina, are you wanting to ask this question?
Yes, I'll ask this one. And it's again about something which is costing absolutely huge amounts of money, 170 billion, and also costing a huge carbon footprint, 1,450,000 tons of carbon. I mean, it's just so big, I can't even get my head around it. So the question is, does the panel feel the time has come to call a halt to HS2 before more money is wasted? Do they agree that it's been made redundant by permanent changes in our working, travelling and commuting patterns due to the effect of the virus over the last year? Do they agree that it's not the greener way to travel, as it will not take enough travellers from road and planes to compensate for its huge carbon footprint? It's going to take until 2035 for it to even get to Birmingham, and then it doesn't go where you might expect into the centre, it goes to the airport, because what it's meant to be doing is facilitating flying. its green credentials appear to be also compromised by the emerging evidence of negligence and unnecessary destruction of wildlife in creating these huge corridors, bigger than a 6-lane motorway you have to, because of the amount of construction that's necessary. And that it's an ecologically destructive vanity project driven through at the expense of much more valuable improvements to our transport network, especially in view of the financial crisis brought by COVID and Brexit. Thank you, Layla.
Thanks, guys. Well, I think every meeting that I've had, almost every meeting, HS2 has come up in some form. And so I think it's fair to sort of update you on where my thinking is about it right now. I mean, I think a lot of what you say, I mean, everything you stated a lot of facts, and they are obviously true, except there's one that I think we need to sort of wait for just a bit. And I would agree that if these changes are permanent, then that would be a game changer. And that is that change of behavior that may or may not stay after coronavirus. Now, I sincerely hope actually that there are going to be a whole host of things that we have sort of learned and better, you know, opportunities to work from home, less commuting, better work-life balance, more appreciation for the green spaces around us and all the rest. I think all of that will stay to some extent. But I am disheartened to see, and if anyone has, and I've had to because of the way Parliament was operating until quite recently, go into London. And the idea that this has fundamentally changed how much people are using their cars is just not evident from my experience of London in particular. Now, I think it is better here. And I think it's also partly driven because people are concerned about getting on buses and using public transport in general. And so that also needs addressing. So to get to the sort of thrust of it, I mean, for those who don't know, and I've said this many times before, Lib Dem party policy has been that we think HS2 on balance should go ahead, notwithstanding the negatives, because we do think that there are positives and long-term positives to it, so long as there is transparency in how this money is being spent, and that, you know, and I agree you can't negate all the negative environmental impact, but overall we think it's worth it. But there is no policy that can't change depending on what happens now. And as I've also expressed to you guys, I've always been sort of on the edge in terms of the value for money arguments. Tina, if what you're predicting is right, then I think this could well be the death knell of HS2. And I sense that in the House, actually people are waiting for that excuse. Interestingly, there's a huge number of Tories who would have absolutely clapped at what you just said and the way you put it, because they agree too. So we're just going to have to wait and see. But if we see those changes, and if it becomes apparent that actually it's not going to do what it's meant to do, I'm not wedded to it in any way. I'm absolutely not ideologically wedded to it. And it is a vanity project, and that's, you know, I understand that completely. If it gets the go ahead, it needs to be, well, if it continues, it needs to be because we hope it's going to work. If any evidence comes along to show that these changes are permanent and everything we thought it was going to change is going to stop, then actually I don't think there is a case anymore. So I suppose that's a long-winded way of saying my position hasn't changed just yet, but I am a bit closer to where you are than I was last time we spoke. And I think that's what I'm waiting for, is to see what happens in terms of behavior when this is all over.
Okay,
Can
Ian.
I ask whether you've read the paper, Layla, that we sent you? You did.
Yeah.
Ian, can I hand over to you briefly?
I mean, in answer to the broad question, yeah, I do think it's long overdue that we call the halt. I think we need to be standing back and not to, no pun intended, see the wood for the trees. I mean, we know the amount of environmental and biodiversity damage that this is doing, which is bad in itself. But it's also the amount of, the absolutely eye-watering amount of money that's being planned for this. And it's, I mean, I remember when it was, I think it was 60 million, then it was 80 million, now it's 100 million. Now it's, I don't know, I think it's 100 million now. It's just, I'm sorry, billion, I should say, not million. It is just a ludicrous amount of money to be spending on one project that has, I think, dubious benefits in terms of transport infrastructure. especially when you compare it to other things like local rail networks, which are desperately needed and which would, I think, have a much greater impact. Even things like bus services in rural communities, which will have an impact on, has an economic impact, because that adds into high street engagement and that kind of stuff. Definitely better broadband, and again in rural communities. I mean, I've got terrible broadband here, and it is a nightmare to try and get it changed because there is a huge amount of money involved in that. And that money, if we're talking the billions and billions we're going to spend on this, one tiny percentage of that could bring fast broadband to everyone in the country. And I don't mean this argument we always talk about coverage. I'm talking about everyone that needs it. And that we'd also be in a position then to address digital poverty, which is another problem. We're moving all these services and things to online, particularly again as part of Charwell's mitigation to the cuts they're going to put in their budget. They were saying, well, we're putting all these services online. So, well, that's not much use if you've not got good broadband or you can't afford broadband. But talking about the behavioural changes, I think they're already there. I think they were already there before HS2 was even thought about. I mean, people sit on the train with a laptop working. And the original argument against HS2 was it's 15 minutes quicker to get to Birmingham. Do you need to be in Birmingham 15 minutes quicker? And anyway, you can sit on the train and work. I don't really see, and as we've seen, that the behavioural shifts in having meetings like we're having now online, I think has been a huge improvement in the way we work, both from a convenience point of view. Certainly, I don't know about you, Layla, but I was only a councillor for a year before this kicked in, and I must admit I find attending the number of meetings I have to do much easier when I can do it online. And I'm hoping that we don't go back to multiple meetings. Obviously, individual meetings, like big meetings, need to happen in real life, but the smaller kind of committee meetings, I think, could still be done online. Particularly as it's for me to go to Bodicote House as a 57-mile round trip, which is not very good for the environment.
And without this, we would never have seen into Handworth Parish Council meetings, and that just.
Yeah. So I think it has shifted already. But what I would say as well about this report, and I know Tina raised it and said, have you read it? I've been lobbied, oddly enough, by the local Labour Party in Kidlington, who have said that they tried to engage with you on this, Layla, and it is slightly. They said that you hadn't really engaged with them on it. I obviously, I don't want to put you on the spot here. It is a sort of area of divergence, and it's the only one I've come across so far between the Lib Dems and the Greens, in our cooperative arrangement.
If they've engaged with me, it wasn't as the local Labour Party, and it's quite possible that they're out of my area. But I have read it, and I've engaged, and yeah, I will take what the Labour Party say often with a pinch of salt, I'm afraid.
Well, he approached me as a Green. He said he supported the Labour Party, but I think it was more from an XR perspective. But what I was going to suggest is that at some point, if I know you're very busy and we're all very busy, if there was some way we could maybe either even just do it by email, have some kind of toing and froing on this report from Tina, which I think is excellent, Tina and other people. And I read through it, and there were things in there that I didn't even realise. And I appreciate it is slightly skewed towards the negative idea of the whole thing, but to be able to sort of hammer out these points so that we can reach some kind of a compromise on our position on it, or at least maybe I would hope to shift your position on it to some extent.
Well, I mean, I have read it and I have considered it, and as I said, it has shifted. It's not just that. I mean, I think that the conversation around HS2 has been shifting over the last year. But I want to see what happens when this is over. And I think it's a more general point around, and I'm excited for the changes that are going to be happening in society. I don't think it's just HS2 that is going to be affected by this. As you mentioned, I think the whole work-life balance, the way people are going to engage with society, I think it does make access to some things easier. I think it's also been more lonely for others. I mean, we'll have to see where it all ends. But I don't think we're going to, get to that point in time for May. So I think we just have to put it down to beauty and diversity, and I will continue to engage. I always will.
I think for me it's timing, because obviously while we're waiting for this stuff to happen, there's more and more destruction happening, more and more money being spent that could go elsewhere. So I think there is an urgency to this. So I hope we can address that at some point.
Okay, is there anyone else particularly wanting to talk on this one? Bob.
Hello, Layla and Diane. I just want to make a general observation about the HS2 issue, which stems into other things. How do we actually create a political culture in which it's okay for somebody in public view to say, well, I thought that then, I had good reasons for thinking it, but I've rethought it, and not people feeling that's to their discredit. I'm thinking about the once upon a time in the 1980s, when Margaret Thatcher was mad keen on privatising railways, and she was held back by moderates like John Major, who then privatised them themselves. At that time, a lot of us said, we need to be modernising the railways. We need to be getting people out of their cars and into trains. And look at the French with these wonderful trains à grande vitesse, TGVs. We should have them here. And now, of course, as the situation changes, we have a TGV type equivalent, and we're saying, hang about, look at the ecological damage. And I think that is a fact that the situation has changed. It's like John Maynard Keynes said, you know, when the facts change, I change my opinion. How do you go about things? But we have to make it possible, I think, for people in the public gaze to say that and not appear weak. And, you know, I'd like Diane and Layla to sort of consider, well, you know, how do we do that? How do we make it possible for people to be like human and say, I've changed my mind?
Okay.
Could I just say one more thing, just very quickly?
I wanted to reply on this, though. I want to reply.
Okay.
This is a question to Diane and Layla, I think.
Okay, it was just to say to Layla that, you know, I take on board what you're saying about we need to see the behavioural shifts, but there's another way of looking at that, is that we need to drive the behavioural shifts. So if we just wait around to see what people do, rather than responding, perhaps, you know, being proactive might be a better way of, you know, if we put the infrastructure in place with things like broadband and that kind of stuff, better connectivity, then maybe that will encourage people.
Yeah,
to shift
there's nothing between us on
you know,
that, Ian. And I've for many years campaigned on better cycling and cycle paths and money for local transport and all that. And I think, you know, we also can't get distracted by this. And I do see HS2 as a bit of a, not a distraction, but it shouldn't stop us from investing heavily in those modal shifts that we do agree on. And if we are going to expend, you know, time and political capital, that's where I would rather focus, because actually we know that the Tories don't get this at all. And so I think we can make a huge difference. And to quickly answer Bob's point, I think actually, Bob, you have to, it all comes from, and I'm gonna end, and I know we're nearing the end of our time, and I'm getting not cynical, but perhaps wiser to the way that some politicians operate. And in order to admit that you are wrong, you have to have started from a point of view of having done something in good faith in the first place. And so when you do that, then it becomes much easier to say you were wrong, because actually you're pivoting, your values tend to not shift that much necessarily. But circumstances will change. And so you can then, you know, be anchored in something deeper than just your raw political advantage at the time. And I think this is why we don't see very much of that happening, because a lot of the politicians who took a position did so for populist reasons, and not necessarily because at the time they felt it was the right thing to do. And then when it comes to shifting ideals that came around, they didn't really know which way to look, and actually they end up losing more by seeming to flip-flop than it is to actually dig a bit deeper into their own principles. And so that's perhaps an observation that I've had, particularly from some of the parliamentarians who, to be honest, I don't have respect for, particularly on the Tory benches, but it's not just on the Tory benches, it's those who have often been around for a very long time. There's also another dimension, which is actually people just get vilified for doing that. And it's even worse now on social media. And if you dare to have even a nuanced position, you're not considered strong enough. If you dare to say, well, actually, I don't know. And I got some of this on Question Time last week. The very final question was about Harry and Meghan. And I was very honest. I don't care. I just don't care. And Fiona said, but there's this review. How could you not have an opinion? And I'm like, I'm sorry, I genuinely think there are other things to be talking about right now than Harry and Meghan and what title they should use. And I'm not going to say what I really think, because I actually genuinely don't think other people care either. But I got some flack. How dare I not have an opinion from the very same people who very often vilify me for having an opinion, one they don't like. And the point is, you're kind of doomed if you do, and you're doomed if you don't. But I've always maintained that if you sort of stick to your principles rather than your guns, you probably get further in terms of your own happiness and your way of changing society. Maybe not so much in politics, but I hope to prove that last point wrong. I do believe you can do both.
Thank you.
Can I
Diane, that was directed at Diane as well, so please do answer, Diane.
Yes, you said some really, I mean, what is culture? What does culture mean? And one of the most simple ways I've heard culture defined is our ways of seeing, our ways of being, and our ways of doing. And of course, those three things are directed, shaped, molded by our values, which is what Layla has just spoken to. I think really cultivating a culture of inquiry where we come as politicians at whatever level with, we're elected to serve, we're there with our constituents, with communities, inquiring together. It goes back to this notion that I'm really pushing for, this idea of experiential knowledge, and also thinking about how we can together inquire, and in so doing, making connections, creating common union, and therefore moving to a place where we can begin to co-create this culture. I believe culture is co-created, and it has to start, it has to begin, I think, at home. How do we educate our children to ask questions, to inquire? I feel there is a dearth of that approach in society, full stop, where we inquire, where we ask questions. And there is a possibility for those that are, in these positions of power to not know, maybe even just not know. But how about we together, because I recognize that you also have knowledge and experience that could count for something very valuable in this space. How about we find some equitable way of exploring together? That would be my short answer. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm afraid we are going to have to stop. We don't have time. We haven't even done half of the questions. I'm really sorry about that, because there's some good questions coming up here, but we have to stop dead on 6:30, and my computer says it is dead on 6:30. So I'd like to thank you all very much for being here. It's great to see lots of familiar faces, and thank you so much, Layla, and thank you, Diane and Ian. And I thought it was really great, and maybe next time it's going to be in person. It should be wonderful.
I can but hope, and it's always a pleasure to be with you guys, and please continue to stay safe and well, and thank you so much as ever for inviting me along. It's an honor and a privilege to be here, so thank you.
Thanks, Layla. Thanks for your time. It's great.
Bye, guys.
Thank you all. It's been wonderful. Thank you.